here is my presentation, Tree Risk Assessment, Perceptions, Reliability, and Reality. Tree risk is also ultimately governed by three things. The likelihood that a target will be impacted. So the more targets you have in a site, the more likely you're going to have a riskier tree. The potential that a tree or tree part will fail. Trees of strong branch attachments, like the one in the top picture, are much prone to branch failure than ones on the bottom, which are coppices, which have been allowed to grow out, or pollards actually. And the consequences of tree or tree part striking a target. So, if you have a tree branch in the top picture hit your car, you're having a bad day. But if you have the branch in the bottom picture hit your car, you're having an even worse day. So size matters when it comes down to consequences. So all of the major risk assessment methods out there have these three inputs: target, likelihood of failure, and consequences. It doesn't matter if it's the old Matheny and Clark method, the new ISA track or BMP method, the stuff they use in UK, which is QTRA. They're all very much the same. Even the Picorni method from the USDA Forest Service, they're all very similar in this regard. And they all share the same concerns, and that is, are they sensitive to the influence of the arborist? Are there inputs in there that are very sensitive and can influence our risk assessment ratings, just given personal biases and perceptions? And are they accurate? So even if we get everything really concise and or consistent and all in a group, are we on target or are we all consistently wrong? And that's things that we need to work on, and that's what my research is working on right now. I'll start with consistency. So and where things are coming in, and where the arborist factors into risk assessment. This is a paper that Tom Smiley and I recently put together. It just came out this last month, I think. And what we did is we had about 300 arborists assess 3 different trees each. And we wanted to look at the different sources of variability among all the ratings inputs and see where things are more variable and less variable, and where we should work on focusing our efforts on increasing consistency. And why is that important? Well, if you have 12 arborists and they come up with 4 different results out of possible 4, then we know that at least some of those are wrong in their risk assessment ratings, and it looks bad on the industry. So if we can tighten things up without being unduly precise and unrealistically precise, that's a good thing. Well, as you can see here, we made a very simple model in that right-hand picture with the 2 circles, where we just looked at the effect of arborist and the effect of tree on predicting risk rating. And when we add all those numbers together and we look at the combined model of arborist and tree together, we can see that we have about 48% of the variation in the system modeled with those 2 factors. Of those 48, about 8% is actually the tree that they're looking at, and 32% is the arborist's influence on the rating. So what that means is, given our data with these 300 arborists, is that the person inspecting the tree is 4 times more important than the tree they're looking at, which was kind of shocking when I crunched the numbers. But we'll show you that it's not all doom and gloom when we look into it a little bit later. So why are things so variable? Well, Ellison, the creator of the QTRA formula in the UK, wrote a really nice paper, and I would look this up if you're interested in risk at all. This is a really interesting paper. It's what got me interested in risk assessment. And he said that things like assessing the probability that a tree or branch will fail are highly dependent on the skill or experience of the assessor. And when we look to see what has influenced ratings in the study here, which is factors driving professional and public urban tree risk perception, we used a fancy conjoint analysis. We found that our decisions, when we just asked someone to give them a gut level rating of risk, over 50% of the rating was dependent on defect severity. We had all these different variables: proximity to the target, target types, tree species, tree size, income level, which related to all the 3 inputs. But when left to their druthers, not channeling their efforts through a standardized system like the track formula, people just naturally looked at the tree and dwelled on the tree and its defects. The only group that actually looked at target at 20% of the decision were the advanced professionals. This was the only one that was statistically significant. So advanced professionals being folks that had like the track training or similar training. So if we focus on tree failure, how well can we assess it? And that was a question that came up after that first study. Is how well can we assess tree risk assessment using visual cues, just the basic assessments that we're most commonly doing in the field? Well, we had a study where we looked at decay in trees in Tampa, kind of copying some work by Chris Luley and others. And what we wanted to do is take a resistance recording drill, or a resistograph as it's commonly called, and drill all of the large live oak and laurel oak, our two main shade trees, along hurricane evacuation routes in Tampa. And when we did this, we found that we wanted to see how often there were a visual indicator associated with trees that had decay when we actually resistographed them. And this is table 3 from that paper, which is frequency, severity, and detectability of internal decay on street trees in Tampa, Florida. As you can see here, our first column is decay severity, going in groups in tens from 0% up to 90%. We had some that were in the 80 to 90% category. Then the next column, we mark which trees in that category, and we assess them after the fact, given the resistograph output, had external decay indicators. And then the number of trees in that level, actually, and then our confidence level. The ones that we got, how many we got correct given the presence of visual indicators. As you can see here, once we got to about 30 to 40% hollow, there were positive and potential decay indicators 83, 100%, 66%, 100%, 100% of the time. So with laurel oak, which is kind of like the silver maple of our south here, these trees were really good at showing decays. So when we're doing visual assessments, I took heart in this because we didn't have to break out our advanced assessment systems to get at least to the point where we could say there was decay in the tree or not. We didn't really talk about severity, but whether or not there was decay present or not. Interestingly, when you looked at live oak, which is kind of like a white oak, or bur oak, very decay resistant, this we were not very accurate at gauging. But the take-home point for this is that these trees were very solid. Well, out of 153 trees, we had about 8 trees that were decayed at the 30 to 90% level. So they didn't decay often, and when they did, they didn't really show it for us. So, but for the trees that we're most worried about, the decay prone, they were ready to give us some sort of sign or outside symptom. So based on that, we want to know, well, that was just one arborist going on in the field. What happened when we had multiple arborists going from a limited visual to a basic to a advanced assessment? When did things change, and did the added information really influence our ratings? So we did a study called Assessment of Likelihood of Failure using Limited Visual, Basic, and Advanced Assessment Techniques. And what we did is we went from a level 1, which is like a drive-by or a walk-by, to a level 2 basic assessment, visual from the ground, to a level 3, which is using either a resistance recording drill or a sonic tomography system. And we had 70 arborists assess 5 trees, going all the way from a limited visual, which was along a pathway, to an advanced assessment of the sonic tomography system. And interestingly, we had, what we did with this experiment is we had them go into 5 different groups, and we had them kind of work together and call out the defects that they saw. And so we wanted to make sure that they weren't missing things, and we even interpreted the output the same. But after that, they had to give their risk assessment rating internally. They couldn't share their risk ratings with other people. We wanted them to have all the same information going into the experiment, but we didn't want them to bias each other on saying whether or not what they saw was severe or not. Well, when we looked at our data, and we're just going to look at the line, not the bars themselves. The lines are means, and we can actually do mean separation with those. We can see that a basic assessment, visual assessment, was about the same as using a basic assessment with a mallet, tapping and seeing if the tree sounded like a bongo drum when you walk around it. And that gave us about the same ratings as a resistance recording drill. When you see the letters there and they overlap, then that means that there's no statistical significance there. But we also saw that the mallet, which is kind of the original sonic tomography, gave us very similar ratings to the actual digital sonic tomography system we were using. So the mallet, the drill, and the tomograph, we had very similar mean ratings. And then, of course, the limited visual, we had the lowest ratings for these 5 trees because people weren't seeing the whole show. They were missing some information. So our basic level assessment, people tended to have the highest level of risk, but it was about for probability of failure, but it was no different than mallet or drill. What about reproducibility? Knowing what people tend to have is one bit of information, and how average scores tend to be is interesting. But I was really interested in the consistency. If having new technology would make things more consistent. Well, if you can see here in the upper right-hand corner, we have what are called violin plots, and the wider the white little curves are, the more individuals you have at that section. So for limited visual for this Siberian elm here, we had essentially a two-way split between possible and probable. But the white dot shows that the majority of folks were in the possible category here. And the black bar shows that there's a skew going towards probable, right? So so limited visual, when we looked at this tree, it had a lot of dead bark, it had a cavity and some insect frass at the base of the tree. You could tell it was deeply planted. When arborists saw this from a footpath, they thought that it was either possible or probable, but most likely possible for a rating of likelihood of failure. And interestingly, when we went to a basic assessment and let people go around it, they were very consistent around probable. And this is something we saw on most of the trees. When we got to the basic assessment, people started to group together within like one rating, which is really interesting to me. When we added the mallet, now we started to skew. People could hear how hollow the backside of the tree was, even though there wasn't a cavity. And we started to skew from probable to imminent. And then when we got to the drill, people, if you look at the sonic tomography output at the bottom, that's the output from the tree. People really didn't know what to do with that. They saw that there were pockets of decay, but there was still a lot of solid wood. And our skew started to go back towards a three-way split between possible, probable, and imminent. But most of the people were still on probable. And then when we got to the level assessment, the last one, when we showed them the sonic tomography output you see in the bottom right, now our median assessment was an imminent. So this is a case where the extra information did eventually make people more, have a lot of consistency in the scores. It actually did raise our average score at the same time. Contrast that with this tree right here, which was a bur oak, had a lot of dead patches of bark, had some conchs up higher in the trunk. Well, when we first looked at this with the limited visual, again, it was a two-way split between possible and probable, with most people looking at possible for likelihood of failure. When we got to a basic assessment, again, we had that same grouping, a lot of people just comfortable around the probable rating and having a very consistent at the basic level assessment. When we brought the mallet in, they could hear with the mallet how solid it was. So again, a lot of people started drifting towards the possible. And when we showed them the resistograph output and the sonic tomography output, they could see that despite all the external signs of possible decay on this tree, it was quite solid inside. And this is a case where the technology almost made a complete four-way split in the ratings, and people just didn't know what to do with the added information. And this is something that we come up with a lot when we talk to people that buy this equipment, is they expect it to have those textbook examples that they see in arborist news or some of the journal articles. But a lot of times the trees are more complicated and then the equipment kind of just confuses the issue a little bit. They don't know how to process all the things that they're seeing. And that comes with a lot of experience and training, and I'm sure the manufacturer of this information will test to that. But it's, everyone's got to learn sometime, and when you first get into it, it can be quite daunting. So back to this study. I mentioned before that even though the arborist is 4 times more important than the tree, we shouldn't lose hope in risk assessment, and I'll show you why in a little bit. Right here, actually. you can see here we wanted to see where this variability was coming from. And what a test of equal variance does is it shows you if one or more of the options has of differing variance than the others. So what we did is we did some very basic tests for all the combinations of assessing likelihood of impact, likelihood of failure, and consequences of failure for 30 trees, and they did the branches, the trunk, and the roots. So there were 90 possible tests that we were running, and we see there out of the 90, about half, 46, we'll just jump ahead, of 46, when we used the Bartlett's test for homogeneity of variance, had differing variances. And we, so we were interested. We looked at the raw data and we plotted out variances. And we want to see, out of these 46, which of them were most variable with regard to likelihood of impact, which of them were most variable with regard to likelihood of failure, and which of them were most variable given consequences of failure. And you see here that of the 46 cases where things differed, 28 of them differed because of likelihood of impact. So target was the most variable thing. The second most variable input was consequences of failure. And when we're talking about basic assessments, just like we saw before with that last study, things were very consistent. Only 2 cases where likelihood of failure was the most variable input for these 90 assessments. And so how do we explain this? How do we kind of rectify what you saw earlier with this? Well, what you see here is when I showed you that figure where 50% of our scenarios were guided by defect severity in that first study, that was just using gut level assessments of risk. We asked them to say, okay, what's the risk in here, 1 to 10, and we didn't have them work through any set structure. And that put people in their comfort zone. We've been assessing risk based on defects alone for many, many years. It's only until recently that there's been an emphasis on target and consequences. And because of that, these two are kind of our weaker of our 3 inputs. We haven't been exposed to it as long, and we haven't really given it serious thought, even though it's been in some of the forums for over a decade. And Ellison wrote in that same paper I like that target is the most significant and most easily quantified element of risk assessment. And now it's important and has really been echoed in our track training, and the forum actually has multiple places for listing target. So one quick question I had with this is, if target's so easy to quantify and it's so important, how good are we at actually assessing it? And what we did is we put traffic counters up in various spots on a campus, and we wanted to see, after we showed people videos, if they were close in assessing the target occupancy for the site. Because people go to a site for like 30 minutes to do an assessment and then they leave, and what happens when they go there at rush hour, or if they go there during the dead of the day in the afternoon, or any other time in between? So what we did is we had 4 sites. We showed them 3 times each. We filmed at rush hour and non-rush hour and different times a year, because it was a campus, or Florida in general, we tend to have more people in the winter than we do in the summer here. And then we actually showed them stills with the actual traffic data to see how their ratings differed. And the one thing that I want to take home from this really quickly, because I don't have a lot of time, is that time of day really influenced scores. We have a coefficient here of 0.63. So what I like to say is, if you think of 10 arborists looking at the scene during rush hour, if they go there, if 10 arborists go there at rush hour, 6 of them will be tricked into raising their rating by 1 point, which can have an impact. And another thing was that when they actually saw the traffic count data for this site, they had the same ratings, there was the same amount of people that had constant, frequent, occasional, and rare, is when they saw it at the deadest part of the year, the summer non-peak for this campus. So having traffic count data made their risk assessments more conservative and less likely to remove the tree. So I'm going to leave with that. It was very quick. I know North American arborists have long focused solely on tree defects. This is played out in several studies. We should take heart in knowing that our basic assessments can be quite consistent with regard to failure potential. Advanced equipment can give us precise estimates of decay and occupancy. There's a lot of studies that show that these things are accurate. We need to work on finding ways to make them useful to people now, because does it matter if we can tell with a mallet that a tree is about 2/3 hollow, or if a resistor graph that's 72.3% hollow. You know, at what point does the added information not benefit us? And we need to work on that through education. And I think we need more defendable thresholds and rules, because things like even the traffic count data, we currently don't know how to really process that, because there's no guidelines in the ISA PMP. So for the ISA track method, which is what I'm working on right now, I think likelihood of impact and consequences of failure are the low-hanging fruit that will, if we can address these through training and kind of tightening up the guidelines, will make our risk assessments way more reproducible without being falsely precise. And of course, because I'm a researcher, I think we need scientifically sound and unbiased research, and we need more of it. So, support the Tree Fund. Thank you.